All right, so that wraps up a bit of the Benny Goodman bit. I think it is time we go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome once again to Mysterious Chicago. I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for about 15 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books, including the Mysterious Chicago book and the Smart Aleck's Guide to American History, and even a novel called Just Kill Me about a ghost tour guide who makes places more haunted by killing people at them. So in addition to all the books, I'm on the History Channel and the Travel Channel and the Smithsonian Channel and all of those pretty regularly, so I am, in fact, incredibly famous. Today is a brand new one. I've only occasionally, I think on a couple of bus tours I might have driven by this, and strangely on my H.H. Holmes tour route, we went by a portion of this, and I'd talk a little bit about it just as we were passing. But we're going to talk a bit today about Camp Douglas, Chicago's Civil War prison camp, which has come up incidentally on other tours, but I've never done a whole one about it. But not just our Civil War prison camp, but the plot to liberate it and burn down the city in 1864. So to begin with, before we really get into the nuances and details and controversies regarding the conspiracy itself, let's take a bit of a look about where Camp Douglas was in Chicago. This is 31st Street, just east of Martin Luther King. And over here you've got this empty space. In the 1920s, this was the home of the Lincoln Gardens Jazz Club, where Louis Armstrong played with King Oliver, and quite possibly smoked his first joint. But it is also about the northern edge of a place called Camp Douglas, land given to the city officially for use as a college by Senator Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's old debate partner and rival. But in the early days of the Civil War, it became a training camp for Union troops, at least briefly. But after a while, it became a prison camp for captured Confederates, which had served in that capacity throughout the course of the war. Here's a map of just kind of where, this is about what it would have looked like from a bird's eye view, which nobody got in 1864. And here's about a map of the boundaries of it. And the actual boundaries are really fairly controversial. In speeches made about 10 or 15 years later, there'd be a lot of conflicting accounts as to exactly what the bounds were. So even then, everything was long gone and nobody really remembered. But you can see up there on the top is 31st Street. Then over onto the side, it extended over to about Cottage Grove Avenue, and down to a little below 33rd Street over here. Also, you can see this section in the middle that says H. Graves. And every researcher who sees this map says, ooh, that must be where they buried the people who died of cholera. Really, we know that several cholera victims were buried on the grounds, or at least they're said to have been, but nobody's really sure exactly where. Most of the people who died here were initially moved up to the Old City Cemetery. They were all supposed to be moved down to Oak Woods. How many of them weren't just dumped in the lake or buried surreptitiously or given to the medical schools is a whole nother question. But really, H. Graves here is just, if you look over onto the side, you can see this house surrounded by trees. That was just the home of Henry Graves. He happened to live in the grounds they planned to use, didn't want to give up his land or moved. He'd lived there for about 30 years by then. And so Mr. Graves just kind of lived in the middle of the Civil War camp. And Henry Graves, of course, comes up with on quite a few of these tours. He came here with his father Dexter Graves in the 1830s. Most known now for being the guy who built the family monument known as Eternal Silence at Graceland Cemetery. Now, tends to be said to be a monument to Dexter Graves. Really, Henry built it for the whole family. Dexter's name just happens to be on top because he was the first one to die. But for about 5 years, Mr. Graves just lived right in the middle of this Civil War prison camp. Now, let's talk a little bit about the prisoners who were in here. Now, by no accounts was this a pleasant place to be. It was a Civil War prison camp. You occasionally hear stories about, horror stories about just how bad it was. Some of them are true, some of them are probably exaggerated. No Civil War prison camp was a great place to be. This didn't have anywhere near the highest death rate at a prison camp, but it definitely wasn't good. It was very, very crowded. They had a lot of problems with things like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever, and all of the other diseases that you get when you cram people together in those days without a lot of sanitation. Also, these guys were mostly captured people from way down south. They thought that 65 degrees was freezing, and now they were here in Chicago. So they had a little extra trouble related to that. Now, I will say that most of these people who were imprisoned here were not exactly Confederate big shots. We can't really blame them for the war. These were mostly just kids who'd been manipulated, lied to, drafted, and then sent off to die. Some of them had no intention of being in the army at all. They just had a choice of either join the army or get kicked out of your state. That tended to happen down there. But let's look at the account. There was one of the prisoners who came in fairly early, really, was a guy by the name of Henry Morton Stanley. Let me put up a picture of him. Henry Morton Stanley would later go on to be a journalist who was responsible for finding David Livingstone. He's this guy who famously said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." But when he was brought into Camp Douglas, we'll go into a little bit of it here. He said, "Our buildings were swarming with vermin. The dust sweepings were alive with them. The men began to suffer from disorders. Dysentery and typhus began to rage. Day after day, my company steadily diminished, and every morning I had to see them carried in their blankets to the hospital, whence none ever returned. Exhumed corpses could not have presented anything more hideous." Now, once again, let's just look at a bit of the mindset of these guys. There was an article that came out in the Chicago Tribune in 1863 that noted that among the prisoners there, many, perhaps a majority, were assuming that Abraham Lincoln was a black man. Now, this wasn't like a conspiracy theory on their part either. It was just what they had heard all along. They just assumed that it was true. They didn't even think it was being covered up. Elsewhere in the article, they also said, well, if he's not, well, surely his wife is then, right? Or the vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, is. He's mixed, right? Wasn't the exact terms they used at the time. I'm cleaning up their language quite a bit here. But you got to remember with these kids, they had come from an area where their information diet was not necessarily varied. All they'd been hearing all their lives, or the last few years, was that Abraham Lincoln was going to burn down your plantation, put all the slaves in charge of you, force your wife to marry one, force your daughter to marry one of them. All these wild things that to them were just the way it was. They hadn't really seen anything to the contrary of this. And there were many accounts of them getting here and being surprised to find out that it wasn't quite as bloodthirsty as they had expected. But in the middle of it, let's tour around a little bit from here. Yeah, that article's like Birtherism of 1863. Very similar stuff. It's something I'm struck by repeatedly just walking around in all of these, just reading through all of these old articles, how many of these articles, if you change a couple of names, could have been written in the last couple of weeks. So here's a little portion of what the camp looks like today. High rises there now. There's also a section, if you get down here to 33rd, probably just a little south of the grounds would have been the jewel store that's over here. I think that by some accounts that's within the grounds, some accounts without. They've redone some of the streets then, which make it a little bit more difficult. And then over here on the edge at Cottage Grove, this would have been about the main entrance and about where Henry Graves would have been. Now, ghost hunters go out here occasionally. It's very difficult to know exactly what we're getting. I've been out there myself. We got some weird audio, but look, there's buildings all over the place around here. So it's not exactly scientific conditions for ghost hunts. There aren't as many stories about this being haunted as really any other Civil War prison camp. But over the course of the war, about 15,000 prisoners were held here. Over the course of the war, about a third of them died, which is a high rate, but certainly not the highest for Civil War prison camps. The warden's daughter remembered that she used to wander around. The bugler's sick call would go, ba 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 ba, ba 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 ba. And she would sing along to it, singing, "Are you all dead yet? Are you all dead yet?" Must have been just a delightful little girl, I would think. So, at any given time, there could be as many as 10,000 prisoners of war being held here just a few miles south of downtown Chicago. And Chicago was spoken of in many parts of the country as a cesspit of abolitionism. But in Chicago, there were also plenty of Copperheads. Copperheads were Northerners who supported the South, sometimes very openly, sometimes even very violently. Meanwhile, back in Richmond, here's President Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet, who in Richmond took a meeting with a guy named Thomas Hines. Thomas Hines was a captain in the Confederate Army who had become kind of a spy. For some, you occasionally see him thought of as like the James Bond of the Confederacy. He was always having daring escapes. But A caveat there is that the reason that he had daring escapes was that his plans never worked out and he had to make a daring escape. But he talked about the conditions he had heard about in Chicago. They all knew about the conditions in Chicago, where one of the biggest newspapers was the Chicago Times, led by Wilbur F. Story, a copperhead if there ever was one. One of his articles from late 1862 called The Impending Dissolution, History Does Not Make Us Acquainted with So Deplorable a Failure as This Administration. This was about the upcoming day when the Emancipation Proclamation would go into effect, which he thought would not be good for unity in the country. He thought it would break the whole country apart. Now, that was one of his lighter ones. Some of his stuff got so incendiary that General Ambrose Burnside, best known for having such fantastic facial hair, tried to shut the Chicago Times down. But Lincoln himself intervened and said, "No, it's freedom of the press. Let him do what he wants." Wilbur F. Story gleefully responded by going back into print and publishing a parody of the battle cry of freedom with lines such as, "For the rights of the white man, hurrah boys, hurrah, where God put the Negro, there let him be. Rally but for white men and maintain the law, shouting the battle cry of freedom." That's really just very typical of Wilbur F. Story's crap. But Thomas Hines knew about this, Jefferson Davis knew about this, and it made them think maybe there was enough support, enough copperheads in Chicago, that they could break open Camp Douglas and take over the city. So Hines was given an order to go to Toronto and start meeting with other people. On the way, he made a bet. According to family legend, he made a bet and won the bet that said, "I bet on the way I can go to Washington, D.C. and shake hands with Lincoln with these orders in my pocket." Family legend said that he actually did it. Whether he really did or not, I have no idea. I suspect not. But he was sent up to Toronto, where there was a place called the Queen's Hotel. The Queen's Hotel, I think this is a later version of it, not the one that would have stood in the early 1860s. But the Queen's Hotel was operating kind of like Rick's Cafe in Casablanca. It was mostly a meeting house for exiled Confederates who had gone to Canada. It was also well known that there were Union detectives all over the place. You couldn't walk into the place without having somebody offer to buy you a drink and try to pump information out of you. Among the people who tended to hold court here was a guy named Clement Vallandigham. I could never quite get his name on the first try. He had previously been a member of the House of Representatives, but he started making speeches about how Abraham Lincoln ought to be hanged, how the war should not be fought, it was cruel, Lincoln was trampling on the Constitution. He was eventually made so many wild speeches that he was exiled to the Confederacy. But he made his way up to Canada and started holding court with all these people who were plotting insurrection. Some people were later referred to him as like the grand superior of the whole conspiracy. In 1863, he tried to run for governor of Ohio from exile in Canada. Didn't quite make it. Thomas Hines came here to meet with him and said he estimated that there were about 80,000 copperheads who would join their cause down in Chicago. Another guy going in and out of there was George Grenfell. He was a British man who worked as a soldier for hire and was sometimes said by these guys to be the ablest soldier they had ever met. So that was all up in Toronto. Meanwhile, down in Chicago, right over here at Clark and Monroe, right where the Weather Bell is at the old Bell Bank that is now the Walgreens now, was a place called the Invincible Club. The Invincible Club was a meeting house for groups with names like the Order of American Knights, the Sons of Liberty, the Knights of the Golden Circle, who all kind of merged under the name Sons of Liberty in 1864. These were Copperhead organizations. Initially they met here. Eventually they moved over to a place called the McCormick Block, which was at Randolph and Dearborn. The McCormick Block would have been named for Cyrus McCormick, who was in Europe at the time. He was the guy who invented the mechanical reaper. During the war, he went over to Europe because he believed that we were going to be sunk into an abolitionist nightmare in the United States. The McCormick Block was not just the meeting place of the Sons of Liberty, as they called themselves. Always got to, these insurrection groups always have to call themselves patriots or we the people or that crap. But there was also a doctor's office in the building, run by a guy named Dr. I.W. Ayers. who decided that he should join the group to work as a spy. And sometimes from the accounts that came out later in the trial, I get the impression that half the people hanging around these meetings would have been spies. But among people who would make speeches there was a guy by the name of Charles Walsh, who lived in Chicago and was making promises to Captain Hines up in Toronto that he was getting people drilled down in Chicago. Whenever the time was right for an insurrection, he would be right there ready to strike. Another guy frequently making speeches was Buckner Stith Morris, who back in the 1830s had been the mayor of Chicago for a year. In 1860, he ran for governor of Illinois, railing against the Democratic candidates, saying that they're all secessionists who want to expand slavery, but then railing even more against Lincoln and Hamlin as being abolitionists. You occasionally hear people say now that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. It depends on how you define it, but you definitely didn't hear that from the Southerners back at the time, or the Southern supporters. Now, Buckner Morris, as a member of the Sons of Liberty, became something a little bit more radicalized. According to Dr. Ayers, during one speech, he said that if we could only break the prisoners out of Camp Douglas, they would send those abolitionists to hell in a handbasket. This is generally considered to be the first recorded use of the phrase hell in a handbasket. Came up in Ayers' later book about this, and also in the trial transcripts, where a couple of witnesses described him making that speech. Apparently, Morris was a real artist when it came to using lines relating to hell and abolitionism. One of his speeches, he said, "As sure as there's a God in heaven, and as sure as there are abolitionists in hell." And another, he would talk about, "We will give the abolitionists hell under the shirt tails," which was usually a term used when they were talking about whipping slaves. So over the course of these speeches, on the lower levels, they just thought it was a club where you would talk about why you hated Abraham Lincoln and why you thought that the South should be allowed to just be let go, or why you even thought we should bring slavery here to Illinois. Levels 2 and 3, they would have all these secret initiation rites that were not exactly secret. Half of them got published in the Chicago Tribune in 1863, but up and above, all they would seem to talk about was how soon we are going to lead this insurrection. We are going to get organized militarily, and we will take over Chicago and bring Chicago into the Confederacy. The initial time that they had decided would be the best time to do this would be August of 1864, when they held the Democratic National Convention here in Chicago. Now, this is early 1864. 1864, General B.J. Sweet was put in charge, May of 1864, and he saw the conditions there were getting bad and did everything he could to try to make them better. He ordered new buildings to be built. He ordered the buildings to be raised up against the ground, which not only made them a little more sanitary, but also made them harder to tunnel out of. But at the time, there just weren't a lot of funds around. They didn't really have the money to give them better food than they could. They didn't have the money for better medical treatment, even though he was able to build another hospital. Plus, they were having trouble with getting overcrowded, because prisoner transfers had stopped. Before 1863, a lot of times the North and the South would exchange prisoners and let the prisons be open. But in 1863, the Union started hiring black soldiers. The Confederacy refused to consider them as soldiers. When they lost a battle, they would just kill them instead of taking them prisoner, or just take them into slavery. Lincoln refused to do prisoner transfers until they would treat them as soldiers. That was beyond the pale for them. So these were the conditions. Then in July of 1864 came the Battle of the Crater in Petersburg, Virginia. This was a thing where the Union tried to blow up a fort in Petersburg from underneath, which they successfully did, but then the charge into the crater was an absolute disaster for the Union. So, talk about up in Rose Hill Cemetery is William Bross, whose brother John was a commander of the United States Colored Troops, one of the white officers, who was killed in the Battle of the Crater. He was a newspaper publisher here in Chicago. And I'll just read a little bit of what he said at the time. At the time of the convention, the gloom that pervaded the whole country was especially thick and murky in Chicago. The copperheads were venomous, whisperings of blood running through the streets ankle deep, and lampposts bearing black Republican fruit were in the air. I sat often at my window on Michigan Avenue and saw the filthy stream of degraded humanity swagger along to the wigwam where the convention would be held on the lakeshore, and wondered how the city could be saved from burning and plunder. But we knew that General Sweet had a small squads of men with signs and passwords in the alley, ready to concentrate at the point of danger at any moment. Everybody was afraid when this convention came. Now, this was the convention to nominate somebody to run against Abraham Lincoln, and it was just expected that all of the big copperheads would be showing up for it. Now, the Chicago Times talked about it like it was the second coming of Jesus or something. The Chicago Tribune talked about it like it was a total amateur hour. But it was held in this temporary tent, known as their own wigwam, down at about where Roosevelt and Michigan is now. So, meanwhile, as everybody came in, all the people who were involved in the big conspiracies started to hang out at the Richmond House Hotel, which was at Michigan and Lake. This became ground zero for the conspirators. I'll just kind of point out where it was now. Right where this glass building is. That would have been the Richmond Hotel. This is where Thomas Hines, where everybody started gathering. Hines was present. Clement Vallandigham, who openly violated his exile. The Union decided it was too bad a PR to arrest him again just to keep an eye on him. Came and actually went so far as to make a speech here. And there are a few reasons that the insurrection didn't come off at the time. In a meeting with Walsh, he had to admit to Hines, no, I haven't really got all the drilling set. We're not really ready to roll. Meanwhile, a couple of the bigger Democratic politicians had gotten everyone together and said, listen, there can't be any violence here. If there's any violence, it will ruin our party for a generation. So, third thing was that they did nominate George McClellan, which after the Battle of the Crater with Lincoln being in bad shape, everybody thought that that was pretty much going to be it. We don't need to have an insurrection. We're going to win the election instead. This is General George McClellan doing what he did best, which was sit on his ass. As head of the army of the Union Army for a while, it was widely thought that he was declining to do anything with the army, just sitting there, just to make Lincoln look bad, so that he could then run against him in 1864, which he did. And a lot of the Copperheads figured, all right, we've got him running now. He will definitely beat Lincoln. No need for an insurrection after all. But then fall of 1864 came around, and General Sherman captured Atlanta. This changed the tides of the war quite a bit, and people in the Copperhead group started thinking, all right, now we're really in trouble. Lincoln might actually win this election after all. But meanwhile, there were 9,000 prisoners being held at Camp Douglas. And that number can vary depending on what record you're looking at, but the middle ground is about 9,000 or so. So there were also only 796 guards. So the guards were outnumbered by about 12 to 1 by the prisoners. Charles Walsh actually started drilling people and started stashing guns all around his house. He had his 4 teenage daughters were helping to load pistols and cartridges. Elsewhere in Camp Douglas, though, there was a guy by the name of John T. Shanks. None of these men is John T. Shanks. I could never find a photograph or even a drawing of John T. Shanks, but he said that he had been a strong Union man in Texas, but was given the choice of either joining the Confederate Army or being kicked out of his state. So he joined the Army, got captured, immediately went to General Sweet and said, listen, I never wanted to be here. Can I make the oath of allegiance and just start working for you? It took a while for Sweet to start really trusting him, but eventually he said, why don't you go talk to Judge Morris and see what happens if you tell him that you're an escaping prisoner. So he went to Judge Morris's house. Buckner Stith Morris, former mayor. And his house, I couldn't find the exact location of. It was number 6 Washington at the time. Everything got renumbered, and the renumbering guide doesn't always help you for stuff before the Great Chicago Fire. But somewhere down this road was his home. It was described as a few blocks west of State Street on Washington. So he came in here, and Buckner Morris said, well, I can't necessarily help you escape. That would be illegal, and I'm not trying to break any laws around here. But why don't you talk to my wife? She's from Kentucky. So he talked to his wife, Mary, and she said, okay, I know exactly what you need to do and where you need to go. First of all, she sent him over to James Geary's clothing shop, which was at about Madison and Wells. James Geary was running a second-hand clothing shop, but he was also a high-ranking member of the Sons of Liberty who was helping Confederate prisoners escape. He not only gave him money to get away, he gave him a train ticket, and he gave him some firearms. So they all continued gathering. Shank didn't end up leaving the city like he was supposed to. He just started taking meetings with these people like Thomas Hines, who were all getting back at the Richmond Hotel, having decided that the time to do things is going to be on November 8th. election night of 1864. So, this was the courthouse. The plan that they had come up with was that there would be a couple of parties. Mr. John Shanks, who was really a spy, would meet up with a bunch of people on State Street, and they would take the public transportation down to Camp Douglas. Meanwhile, there would be a whole group of people on every side of it ready to break down the walls and start storming people out. According to Captain Shirley, who worked there, he said, "After the war, I questioned some of the most intelligent in reference to the conspiracy. These prisoners told me they had been divided into companies, regiments, and brigades, and confidently expected officers from the South to command them, and the intention was to destroy Chicago. First, they would take over the courthouse. Once they took over the courthouse, they would be able to interfere with the election, throw out all of the Lincoln ballots, then wait for more reinforcements to come. More reinforcements would come, the telegraph lines would be cut, the railroad depots would be destroyed, and then Chicago itself would be destroyed." And all throughout the city, people knew that these sort of things were being planned. Up over here on top of the hill at Graceland Cemetery is Ann Hosmer. Ann Hosmer worked at the Soldiers' Home, made several trips to the front, and said the day of the election was much dreaded by all. Rumors were that the city would be burned. Those were days of great anxiety, and I felt we were living on a volcano ready to burst at any moment. This is an unmarked grave for her up over here. This draped tree stump grave is for her son, who died of diseases, managed to survive the war but contracted diseases during it. Now, she wasn't the only one who was worried about things like this, though. On the Copperhead side, Wilbur F. Story's Chicago Times was publishing articles like this: "Plots of Old Abe to carry the election in Illinois. No one except loyal men will be allowed to vote. Horrible sufferings of Union prisoners. Old Abe might release them, but will not. The situation on the Potomac." But meanwhile, all of the usual suspects were gathering again back at the Richmond House. There was Thomas Hines. There was George Grenfell, the soldier for hire from England. Clement Vallandigham managed to stay out of the city, but he had emissaries there working for him, making his intentions known, and also Colonel Marmaduke. Colonel Vincent Marmaduke was, by some accounts, a Confederate colonel, though he later denied ever having been such a thing, but is another guy said to have been one of the major movers. And this time Charles Walsh told them, "All right, we've got everything, we're ready to go." But they were also meeting with John Shanks, who was a spy. They were also meeting with Dr. Ayers, who was a spy. And it's entirely possible that the spies may have outnumbered some of the biggest ones here. So on November 6th, having communicated everything back to General Sweet sent his detectives out to start making arrests. The biggest one was a few houses down from Camp Douglas, somewhere on Cottage Grove. There's this neighborhood right across the street called Groveland Park, established 1855. This was a subdivision made on Senator Douglas's land during Senator Douglas's lifetime that is still about the only part of Bronzeville that's still a part of it today. Somewhere down around here, there's conflicting accounts as to the exact location, but Charles Walsh's house was here. The raiders came in, found that he had about 300 guns and several thousand rounds of ammunition stashed. And he tried to say, "Oh no, I'm just holding these for a Union militia," but they were all loaded and ready to go. What they didn't realize at the time of the raid was that Thomas Hines was hiding in a mattress the whole time. So he was able to make one of his typical daring trademark escapes. Meanwhile, down over on West Adams Street was down with a shadow of where the Sears Tower would eventually be, just a little bit east of the river, was the home of a Sons of Liberty man named Edward Edwards, where they found Colonel Marmaduke hiding. Grenfell was found back at the Richmond Hotel, along with a couple of other people, and over at Dearborn and Randolph, right next to the McCormick block where the Sons of Liberty met, was the Madison House Hotel, where they found lots and lots of guns. So all of the pieces were in place here. The prisoners at the jail thought that there was something up, and apparently were even organized into companies and had their orders for what to do when the raid began. Guns were found stashed. These are just a few of the places where they found firearms stashed. All of the major players were identified and rounded up. And so on the morning of the election, it was announced that there had been a rebel plot. Charles Walsh was captured and made a full confession. Details of the plan: the Poles to be invaded, the prisoners at Camp Douglas to be set free, general sack of the city intended, plunder, rapine, fire, bloodshed in the streets of Chicago, the city to be laid in ruins. There's enough paperwork to establish that Jefferson Davis knew all about this and had put money behind it. So here's some of the reactions in the news at the time. Well, first of all, of course, we've got the Chicago Tribune here. But there were also people, especially on the Copperhead side, who believed that the whole thing was just a setup. The whole thing was just what we would now call a false flag. The Rock Island Argus published this. Republicans making asses of themselves. A ridiculous electioneering trick. Last card of the desperate shottyites. Their belief was that the whole thing had just been something that General Sweet imagined and then announced to make himself look like a hero and to make the Confederates look bad. The Chicago Times up in Chicago had pretty much the same thing. Based on the find of the arms, they said the arms found in his house were either placed there by abolition plotters or were undoubtedly the weapons of the old Shields and Emmett Guards, not mentioning that they were all loaded and ready to go. And I love this. He blamed, no, there weren't really Confederate plotters. It was actually abolitionists in disguise trying to make us look bad. In other words, this is very much the 1864 version of saying, no, that wasn't QAnon people. It was really Antifa the whole time. But having made all of these arrests, all of these guys were rounded up and initially held here at Madison and Clark in the old Trinity Church, which after the fire would be moved over to Madison and Jackson. I couldn't find a picture of the one that existed before the fire here, just the later one that was on about like Jackson and Wabash. But they were held here initially, including Buckner Morris was eventually sent to Camp Douglas himself. 2 Chicago mayors ended up there, both Levy Boone for helping prisoners escape, and Buckner Morris for making speeches about how he was going to send those abolitionists to hell in a handbasket. But since it was hard for them to get a fair trial in Chicago, which the whole city knew that they were planning to blow them up, the trial was held in January of 1865 in Cincinnati. But the charge was very real. Charge 2, conspiring in violation of the laws of war to lay waste and destroy the city of Chicago, Illinois. In this, Charles Walsh, Buckner S. Morris, Vincent Marmaduke, Charles Daniel, George Grenfell, B.M. Anderson. It's hard not to chuckle reading the initials sometimes. They refer to B.M. Anderson and B.S. Morris. So over the course of the trial, Buckner Morris ended up being acquitted. He had been very careful in his speeches. He talked about how we could take over Camp Douglas, and we could have Abraham Lincoln hanged, and we could form an army, but stopped short of actually saying to do so. His wife was found guilty of helping all these Confederate prisoners escape, but the whole time when she was doing it, he had just sat back and said, "This isn't on me. I'm not the one doing this." She was exiled to Kentucky after that. Mr. Grenfell, the soldier of fortune, was initially sentenced to be hanged, but then his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment on the Dry Tortugas prison in Key West. This is also where they sent the Lincoln conspirators. One of his cellmates who wrote about him frequently was Samuel Mudd, the doctor who had said John Wilkes Booth's name, sometimes said to be the reason people use the phrase, "Your name will be Mudd." It was already in use by the time of Samuel Mudd being captured, helping John Wilkes Booth escape, but this certainly helped make it more popular than it had been before. Now, he wrote about Mr. Grenfell pretty frequently in here, but eventually Grenfell hatched a daring plan to escape from the prison and was never heard from again. He sailed off in a boat in the middle of the storm. Dr. Mudd's opinion was that he probably drowned in the attempt, but it's one of those things where we're never really going to know for sure. Meanwhile, Vallandigham was not arrested at the time. They had enough evidence that they could have arrested him for his involvement in this, but they decided that arresting him was probably exactly what he wanted to happen. He thought that this would make him a great martyr to the cause and help him get elected to office again. So he was let go, became a criminal lawyer, and in 1871 he was defending a guy who was accused of shooting a guy who'd been sitting in a chair. Now, Vallandigham decided that he would demonstrate, no, this man accidentally shot himself. Let me explain to you how it was done. I will reenact it right here. So he pulled out a pistol that he thought was unloaded to reenact how the guy might have accidentally shot himself. Turned out the gun was in fact loaded. He shot himself in the bladder and died. If you look on YouTube, there was a whole horrible history segment on Clement Vallandigham and his stupid way to die. As for the rest of the Where Are They Now section, the short answer is they all died. And quite a few of the people associated with this ended up in Rose Hill Cemetery. Just the other day, we had quite a thing on a morning mini tour. I managed to track down the unmarked grave of Buckner Stith Morris, the guy who was known to say that we should hang Abraham Lincoln, that abolitionists will be sent to hell in a handbasket, that as sure as there's a God in heaven, an abolitionist in hell. So here's me doing the Charlie Brown dance on his grave. Acquitted, but mainly it was just because of kind of a let's just let bygones be bygones kind of thing. Meanwhile, over on the side, General B.J. Sweet has a monument here that was placed here by his daughters, who themselves became, one of them was a reporter, one of them was a writer. They became kind of icons of women's rights in their own right. But that's a whole other tour. But Benjamin Sweet, oddly enough, is right near, we'll just walk over from here. Right in front of him is Wilbur F. Story, who said that the whole thing was a false flag in the Chicago Times. Just a whole thing to make the Confederates look bad. And of course, we've all seen this before, but we all know what I think of Wilbur F. Story. Here's me dancing on his grave, too. All right, so that is the story of the insurrection of 1864. It's the short version. That whole trial transcript survives. If you poke around, you can probably find it online. I haven't read the entire thing. It's like 750 pages long. But I went through quite a bit trying to find what I could. I'll stick around for questions later, but first let's quickly plug the upcoming tours. Thursday night will be my first ghost tour since October, a virtual ghost tour right here on Mysterious Chicago, recreating some of the first tours that I ever did in the city. Followed on January 31st, a week from today, by Villains of Architecture, also known as the Bad Boys of Architecture. This is not just an architecture tour, it's also a bit of behind-the-scenes stuff about the fact that rock stars in the 1970s had nothing on early 20th century architects when it came to debauchery and problematic behavior. Also, we do mini tours every day at 10 o'clock. Tomorrow will be Mural Monday, and Fridays are Find a Grave Friday. Other days of the week, you never know what might happen. Then Friday nights at 6:30 on the Patty Vasquez Show Facebook page is Whiskey and a Cookie, in which Patty and her friends, including myself, drink whiskey, eat cookies, and discuss the events of the week. So that's what's upcoming. Also, if you want a Mysterious Chicago t-shirt, hoodie, coffee mug, shot glass, they have all of those things over on cafepress.com/mysteriouschicago. So you can be just like these fine Georgia voters here. And incidentally, here's my mom with the president and my mom with the first lady. Back at the caucus time. But anyway, once again, quick upcoming ghost tour on Thursday, Villains of Architecture on Sunday. And until then, I will put the Benny Goodman back on and we'll just hang out and talk about food and music like we usually do. Thanks a lot for joining me, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago, and here is Benny Goodman.